It may be no coincidence that Hong Kong, the Temple of International Commerce, was chosen to host the 6th International Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. For many days prior, the international media analyzed the event and the enormous repercussions it will have on the world economy. At the heart of the debate is agriculture, the most controversial aspect of world trade. Upon his arrival in Hong Kong, the night before the summit inauguration, José Bové, one of the most charismatic leaders of La Via Campesina, is arrested at the airport and prevented from entering the city.
I think they tried to stop me from entering because the Hong Kong authorities tried to prevent demonstrations by the anti-globalization movement. And the Hong Kong authorities tried to halt the dynamic of these social movements in the streets. And that's why they tried to prevent me from entering.
But what is exactly the World Trade Organization?
La OMC.
I don't think the WTO is the demon some claim it is. But it must have something going for it, as is a queue to join. There are loads of countries trying to join. We've just had 3 to do so. Saudi Arabia, Togo, and another one. 150. And there's a queue.
While the ministerial conference is held in the gigantic Crystal Palace Conference Center, an anti-summit takes place in the nearby Victoria Park Gardens. Some 5,000 people from more than 300 farming, social, and non-profit groups worldwide express their dissent from the WTO and denounce the perverse effects of liberalization, to be found particularly among the poorest of developing countries. Those most harmed are the farmers and rural populations of both hemispheres, who paradoxically represent over half of the world population. In Victoria Park, there is an atmosphere of companionship, solidarity, commitment, and opposition.
We insist the free trade treaties, the WTO, are violating our right to continue being farmers, our right to produce food, our right to produce raw material for our industries. We are being eliminated. In these years of the free trade agreement, more than 200,000 jobs have been lost. And immigration, a galloping emigration, has created rural ghost towns. First of all, immigration is not that easy. Emigrants must risk their lives to enter those countries with manpower needs, and where using cheap labor is encouraged. On the US-Mexico border in the last 10 years, around 3,000 Mexicans have died.
唔使坐，我哋可以留翻上去。
Millions of rural inhabitants on all continents have had to abandon their homes to emigrate. First to the poorest urban suburbs of their cities, then to the developed countries. In Asia, liberalization of rice farming has ruined thousands of farmers, leaving them without their land. In the first large demonstration on the 13th of December, South Korean farmers throw themselves into the Hong Kong Bay to illustrate how the WTO is drowning them.
Another phenomenon is that in the last 5 years, the immigration of young single women to the US has increased. In the fields, especially in Florida, California, and the area we are in now, there's a strong presence of female immigrants. And these female immigrants are in much harsher conditions than the men.
We probably haven't made much headway. We're halfway through the conference, and I can't see much in the way of advances for family farms. And what does this have to do with women? I think that of all the organizations here, few perceive what we're talking about. The impression I get, the certainty I have, is that when we speak in the name of farmers around the world, we're speaking for only half of them. There's another half which is composed of women who are in totally unfavorable position, living in absolute poverty in all continents. These women are in a much worse situation than that of family farmers taken together. It's a difficult process, but channels of communication have been opened. It's important to point this out, and some of our achievements are very important, although not sufficient.
If you listen to Amodio today, you'll hear him say that the European Union shouldn't wait at all. It should reform its agriculture because it is the product of an injustice that has been going on for decades. So it shouldn't expect anything in return. It's an issue of absolute justice that we dismantle all our agricultural support systems, and then we can talk. Ours is the dissenting voice in all this. We have the exact opposite perspective of those that have been expressed here. We believe that these negotiations are offering very little to developing countries, that what is being put on the negotiating table by the EU and the US is a very modest offer that doesn't satisfy not only countries such as Brazil and Argentina, the heavily criticized big exporters, but African countries, Central American countries, and South Asian countries which are not going to see any of their fundamental expectations met. The European Union is certainly not the bad guy in the picture, and neither is European agriculture. What is clear is that we are the worst salespeople. Regarding the sales pitch of the European Commission's proposal to the media, we haven't been particularly agile. In part because it is assumed, and other countries take for granted, that the EU will undertake reform outside the framework of this WTO conference. In this respect, some countries like the United States are playing their cards accordingly and bluffing. They are able to mobilize social backing for their positions, and we know what's behind them. So they are bluffing, if not outright cheating. We are obviously convinced that farming, society and consumers need an agricultural sector with farmers, and that is the fight we will continue. For us, being here in Hong Kong, in addition to our stand of conviction and commitment, is also about showing support to family farms in countries like South Korea, Thailand, Bangladesh, Asian countries, and in all countries, because it's the same fight, and it is a fight we have chosen.
Within the conference, tensions grow, and the possibility of reaching the compromises needed for an agreement seem very remote.
The terms of the debate have been set from four distinct perspectives. On one side, the European Union. On another, the United States. The third element, which is now in play, are the exporting countries led by Brazil. And the fourth large group are the less advanced countries. Strangely, the positions of the European Union are much closer to those of the less advanced countries, in spite of what's being said in the media. And it is the United States and the big exporting countries which are now leading a more aggressive fight for liberalizing the agricultural trade, although from totally different perspectives. The most important thing happening here from the CONTAG point of view is that poor countries, the developing countries, those countries which prior to Cancun had enormous difficulties to organize themselves, to hold common stands, are no longer toys of the United States or of the European Union. All the WTO agreements, then current, were highly damaging to poor countries and to family farming worldwide. They generate dumping, enormous export subsidies, without any type of support for family farming. And these rules must be changed.
On the negotiating table are policies affecting the identity, ancestral culture and lifestyles of millions of farmers worldwide.
I think that we have seen a change develop here in Hong Kong. A political change produced by the adjustments of the last few decades, as well as some contradictions. The agenda imposed by rich countries upon poor and developing countries, consisting of opening and liberalizing their markets, and the impact of this process on agricultural economies.
If at this moment there were a WTO agreement to be effective the 1st of January of 2007, for Spain, the impact would be nil, because we are going to do it anyway on the 1st of January of 2007.
The revised PAC supports will be received in any case. They are not dependent on how this summit evolves. Therefore, taking up here an agenda of agrarian reform, of rural development, one which permits reflection and collaboration in overcoming poverty and social exclusion, is very important. We're going to focus on these new challenges as an updated agenda. The agenda of agrarian reform and of rural development is not an outdated agenda. They are contemporary agendas which require, from democratic governments, a responsible, dedicated and committed adoption.
Paradoxically, Hong Kong, that strange and fascinating city where extremes of wealth and poverty live side by side, is transformed into a mirror reflecting the enormous inequalities to be found in the world. Extremes of riches and misery on the same stage. These same paradoxes have moved to China, the giant dragon which is waking up and capable of incinerating the weaker world economies in a single breath. China was granted full membership in the WTO in 2002 and accepted a series of important commitments towards opening and liberalizing its economic regime. At long last, the golden door of the Orient, dreamed of since the days of Marco Polo in the West, has opened to the promise of unlimited riches. But reality has proven to be otherwise, and products from China are flooding world markets and causing serious damage to many industrial sectors and countries on the receiving end. In the eye of the hurricane is the status of industrial labor, approaching the slave labor conditions of millions of Chinese workers, many of whom were farmers who emigrated to the cities. The big challenge here is if we will be able to export and globalize human rights and social justice. Currently, 80% of the 6,000 factories which supply the North American Walmart, the biggest company in the world, are in China. The 8th of February 2004 edition of the Washington Post states that while capital roams the world looking for cheaper and more flexible labor, and while poor countries rely on multinationals to provide jobs and open export markets, Walmart and China have formed an extreme version of a risk capital joint venture. And this venture is setting the tone for work conditions and consumption all over the world. At the WTO summit, agriculture remains the most complex and heated issue on the agenda, generating enormous controversy and focusing interest on the conference. In Victoria Park, the South Korean farmers honor the memory of John Lee, who committed suicide by self-immolation at the 2003 WTO summit in Cancun, wearing a sign that said, "The WTO kills farmers." Demonstrations increase in intensity and continue to fill the streets of Hong Kong under the watchful eye of its peaceful citizens, who witness a metaphorical funeral for the WTO. The demonstrators raise their voices, calling for the abolition of the WTO, which they see as an anti-democratic organization at the service of increasingly concentrated economic interests, which allow and foment world poverty and hunger. On the 17th of December, before the summit ended, the most radical mobilization of Asian protesters is expected. An enormous tension fills the air. 2 weeks before the WTO conference started, In mainland China, in Dongzhou, a rural village in the southern province of Guangdong, farmers protesting the expropriation of their lands at unfair prices to make way for an industrial complex were fired upon the police, killing dozens. The backdrop, the fight for land. In Hong Kong, 9,000 riot police and soldiers patrol the city's main arteries, especially the Wan Chai district in the city center, as well as all the streets leading to the ministerial conference in the convention center, turning it into a steel and glass bunker.
How to define what could be violence and non-violence? Because from the beginning we understood that we had to define this clearly in order to develop a main objective for us, to convince worldwide opinion and public opinion here in Hong Kong that the WTO is bad. It is bad for our rights as citizens. We were not able to place 400 people inside the convention center for about 3 minutes, which would have been a turning point. When we got close to the convention center, there were about 1,100 of us, and all exit points were then blocked, and we were told we were under arrest.
The following morning, international media gathered data on the farmer demonstration. 900 protesters had been arrested. On the 18th, with the activists neutralized, the summit desperately seeks an emergency compromise. Will an agreement finally be reached?
J'espère.
I hope that these talks end in a failure for the WTO, and that there is no agreement when the weekend finishes. At the same time, if there is no failure, then there is a chance to articulate new measures and to submit economic logic to fundamental human rights and to shift power from the multinational corporations to political institutions. They are preparing a document which will allow them to move on and to leave Hong Kong, claiming that this has been a success and that in March, April or even June, they'll be able to start another Doha round. A Doha round which has nothing to do with social development or development at all. It is simply free trade, and free trade.
The streets of Hong Kong return to normal. The WTO talks are reaching an end. In the wee hours of the morning, a ministerial declaration is signed, an agreement of absolute minimums.
We cannot call the result a success or call it a failure. I believe it is a moderate success. Maybe the two most important agreements of this conference will have a positive impact on the poorest countries. One of them would be the elimination of subsidies to agricultural exports by the year 2013. A historic claim of developing countries which we were able to agree upon in this conference. And the other one would be the commitment to allow free passage of goods from the least developed countries to developed ones, and which in fact would cover 97% of imports.
We leave Hong Kong with the feeling of exiting a city of virtual reality, a mirage of never-ending skyscrapers and lights which could vanish in an instant, just like the Matrix universe in which we seem to live. and we are incapable of perceiving the devastating reality of hundreds of millions of human beings and their cry of desperation.